Willie Moretti was a central figure in the American underworld, a man who built his reputation alongside some of the most influential crime bosses of the 20th century, such as Charlie "Lucky" Luciano, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Meyer Lansky. Moretti's rise to power was shaped by his associations with these giants of organized crime, particularly during the volatile Prohibition era. Moretti, known as a loyal muscleman for powerful figures like Longy Zwillman, was deeply entrenched in the criminal enterprises that defined the era. From gambling and racketeering to political corruption and money laundering, Moretti's reach extended across various industries and territories, including New York, New Jersey, and beyond. Though often described as charming and likable, Moretti was also notorious for his violent tendencies and womanizing, which, much like Al Capone, contributed to both his rise and downfall. He was infamous for his erratic behavior, a symptom of his syphilis diagnosis, which slowly ate away at his mind and body. By the 1950s, as the disease progressed, Moretti had become a shadow of the dangerous and powerful man he once was. During a time when organized crime was becoming more scrutinized by law enforcement and government bodies, men like Moretti could no longer operate in silence and obscurity. In the early 1950s, as the U.S. Senate's Kefauver Committee began investigating organized crime, Moretti was one of the figures called to testify. In stark contrast to many of his associates who chose to remain silent, Moretti was surprisingly talkative and candid. He painted a colorful picture of his life, openly discussing his gambling habits, wealth, and connections. At one point, he even bragged about keeping $30,000 in cash at home for incidental expenses. His charm shone through as he regaled the committee with the tales of his election winnings and wry observations about how everything is a racket in modern society. Despite his affability, Moretti's decision to talk during the hearings was a dangerous misstep. In the world of organized crime, silence was a code of survival, and his willingness to divulge details to the Senate made him a liability to his peers. It became clear that Moretti's mental state, weakened by syphilis, was causing him to lose his grip on reality and on the unspoken rules that had kept the mafia's operations hidden for decades. This lapse in judgment would eventually lead to his demise. Moretti's death in 1951, at the hands of his former allies, marked a turning point in the world of organized crime. His execution was a direct consequence of his loose talk during the hearings, and it signaled the beginning of a broader power shift within the mafia. The old guard of Prohibition-era mobsters like Moretti was being replaced by a new generation of gangsters, more cautious and attuned to the evolving political and legal landscape. His assassination was a message to anyone else in the underworld who might be tempted to speak out. Loyalty and silence were paramount. The world of organized crime was evolving. Families in cities like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans were still heavily involved in gambling, narcotics, political corruption, and unions, but the 1950s marked the beginning of a new era. This shift would see the mafia evolve into a more sophisticated syndicate, with its influence extending into legitimate business ventures, real estate, and even stocks. Despite the crackdown on organized crime, the families continued to thrive, shaping American society for decades to come. Moretti's story is emblematic of the end of one era and the beginning of another. He was a man who lived by the rules of a bygone time, where brute force and charisma could make you a king in the underworld. But as the spotlight on organized crime grew brighter, men like Willie Moretti were forced to adapt or die. His tragic end was a stark reminder that in the world of crime, no man, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of betrayal, illness, or the changing times. In late 1950, Luciano received an unexpected visit from a powerful mobster, none other than Carlo Gambino. Carlo came bearing troubling news. Willie Moretti, the New Jersey mobster and once close friend, had been diagnosed with syphilis, and the disease was ravaging his mind, just as it had done to Capone years before. Gambino, representing the interests of the Mangano and Anastasia factions, was sent to see if Luciano had any solutions to offer. Willie's brain was rotting, Gambino explained. He was losing control, and half the time no one knew what he might say in public. He had to be watched every time, like a ticking bomb ready to explode. The council had already voted Willie had to go. It wasn't just for their protection. It was, they claimed, for his own good. Luciano, once the mastermind behind countless hits, now found himself sickened by the thought of taking another life, especially that of a friend. The whole idea of killing anyone after a lifetime of it began to turn my stomach, he confessed. And now I had to vote on whether to kill a guy who had been one of my best friends. Luciano ordered Gambino to hold off the hit, demanding they at least try to save Willie. I told him about no hit on Willie unless we've exhausted every option. Get him the best doctors. Park Avenue. The Mayo Clinic. I didn't care. As long as it wasn't one of your bullet hole specialists, Luciano insisted. He knew Gambino's type, and what kind of doctors they tended to consult. But it was all for nothing. Behind Luciano's back, Gambino acted swiftly. Perhaps it was the realization that Luciano had softened, that his mind was distracted by a new girlfriend, or that his grip on power was weakening. Either way, Gambino made his move. On October 4th, 1951, Willie Moretti was gunned down, shot twice in the head like a boss ought to be, in a restaurant near Cliffside Park, New Jersey. No messy aftermath, no heat on Luciano like the Bugsy Siegel hit. The execution was clean, precise, just how Gambino liked it. However, the killers made one crucial mistake during the hit amid the chaos. One of them lost his hat, and, in the frenzy, forgot to pick it up. This small oversight would soon become infamous. The very next day, newspapers splashed the headline across their front pages: "Killer's hat left at crime scene. A clue in the gangland slaying." This seemingly minor detail captivated the public's imagination, turning a forgotten hat into the key symbol of the bloody assassination that had unfolded, marking the beginning of an intense manhunt. Here is that very article for you to listen to. Hackensack. An odd-shaped grey fedora may lead police to the killer of Willie Moretti, if the police can get there before Willie's friends. The hat was one of two left behind, when four thugs, who a minute before had shaken hands warmly with Moretti, dashed from Joe's restaurant, 793 Palisade Avenue, Cliffside Park, leaving the 57-year-old bootlegger, gambler, philanthropist, and perpetual commentator on the ways of gangdom kicking out his life on the tiled floor. Albert Anastasia, a Fort Lee resident named at the Kefauver committee hearings as a former top figure in the Murder Incorporated Brooklyn gun-for-hire mob, was briefly questioned last night at the office of Deputy Attorney General Harry L. Toe. Toe and his investigators had heard last night that Moretti had recently arranged to buy a $50,000 Florida home. When Deputy Attorney General Max Eisenstein, Paul Huckin, Stephen Toth, and a corps of investigators led by Acting County Detective Chief Nathan Allen were told by a Cliffside Park witness that Moretti had been seen standing outside the restaurant before the shooting, with a stocky man wearing an odd-shaped grey fedora. Anastasia sharply looked up, a glint of recognition in his eyes. A detective prompted, "You could help us a lot, Al." But Anastasia wasn't forthcoming. He sat calmly until released, commenting only that Moretti was a fine family man and that the killers did a dirty thing to the restaurant owners by blowing Moretti's brains all over their floor. He was referring to Joseph and Jenny Cravata and their son Joseph Jr., who lived upstairs over the restaurant. Chef-released father and son were held last night in the county jail as material witnesses along with Mrs. Dorothy Novak, a 33-year-old waitress from 720 Bergen Boulevard, Ridgefield. Mrs. Novak, was the restaurant waitress who saw the 4 men who gunned down Moretti. Released after questioning were Joseph Amenta, the chef at the restaurant, and Mrs. Cravata. Moretti's killing may signal a return to the days of bloody Bergen, when Prohibition-era gangsters settled internal strife with revolvers and shotguns. There is little doubt that the friends of the rotund, garrulous Moretti are conducting their own investigation, undeterred by red tape, with a quick execution for the man or men identified as Moretti's murderers. After more than 12 hours of continuous questioning, Toe offered no motive for the killing, and admitted he had no suspects when tired investigators finally left the county courthouse at 1:30 in the morning. He wasn't commenting on the multitude of rumors circulating about the motive behind Moretti's death. But the most persistent theory was that Moretti, the fabulously wealthy squire of Hasbrook Heights, was near broke. Several pieces of evidence supported this seemingly incredible belief. In Moretti's inside jacket pocket was an envelope from the Lincoln Mutual Life Insurance Company. Inside was a letter indicating that Moretti had cashed in a life insurance policy before maturity for the cash value of $2,400. But how did this square with Moretti's reputed 1/10 interest in the $1 million sale of the U.S. Linen Supply Company? One answer was that Moretti was a heavy bettor. On the seat of his 1951 cream-colored Packard convertible parked outside the restaurant were his selections for horse races that day, with $500 notations. Account stripped. One of his horses came in 4th. The frank gambler, who boasted to the Kefauver committee that he always bet winners, may have been picking a succession of 4th-place horses. Also found in the car was a bank book from the Woodridge Savings Bank, which showed a $10,000 balance in February, but had now dwindled to $200. Moretti had recently sold his mansion on Bell Avenue, Hasbrook Heights, for $65,000, a sale scheduled to close shortly. He was supposedly underwriting legal expenses and fines for some friends in prison. When he died, in his pocket was $1,845, including 14 $100 bills and the rest in smaller denominations. According to Eugene Hausling, from Deputy Attorney General Nelson Stamler's staff, Moretti left his home shortly after 10 in the morning yesterday. He was seen outside a vacant store that used to be Duke's Restaurant, a gangland hangout, shortly before 11 in the morning, across from the closed Palisades amusement park on Palisade Avenue, Cliffside Park, just a block from the restaurant where he was killed. With him was a stocky man wearing an odd-shaped grey hat. Mrs. Novak said 2 men were waiting in the restaurant. One went out to meet Willie at about 11:20 in the morning, and the 2 returned, followed by Willie and the other 2 men. 2 of the men sat at the counter, while 2 sat at a table with Moretti. Mrs. Novak served a glass of orange juice to one of the men before Moretti arrived. They all shook hands and conversed in friendly fashion in Italian. Mrs. Novak went to the kitchen for a menu, and while she was there, shots rang out. Mrs. Cravata timidly stuck her head out the swinging door of the kitchen. The anguished voice of Moretti called out, "In here, in here." Mrs. Cravata fainted. When the others summoned the courage to look out, the 4 men were gone. How or where they disappeared, no one knew. But there lay Moretti, under the second table from the entrance, face down. His left hand was clawing at his blood-stained shirt, and his head had been shattered by 2 bullet wounds, believed to be .38 caliber slugs. Young Cravata called Cliffside Park Police, and Chief Frank N. Borrell, along with Detective Sergeant Michael Hoser and their aides, quickly moved in. Borrell notified Deputy Attorney General Max Eisenstein, and Eisenstein's initial reaction when Borrell reported that Moretti had been shot and killed was typical of most who heard the news. "All right, Frank, I can go along with a gag. Now what do you want?" What made Meyer Lansky stand out in the world of organized crime was his remarkable ability to adapt and survive through multiple eras. Whether it was the 1920s during Prohibition or the 1930s, dealing with the complexities of the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration, Lansky remained resilient. During World War II, while many were focused on fighting fascism, Lansky was quietly maneuvering through the chaos, doing his best not only for his country but also for his Jewish heritage. In the underworld, as governments experience shifts, so too do crime families and their leaders. The 1950s marked another period of transition, but Lansky was a genius who could read the changing times. He began aligning himself more with the Genovese faction, recognizing that Vito Genovese was on the verge of becoming a dominant force in organized crime. Lansky, always the strategist, would often back Genovese's decisions at key meetings. Just as he had once advised Lucky Luciano, he now provided guidance to Genovese on various matters. Whether it was pushing Frank Costello into retirement, navigating the complexities of the drug trade, or dealing with figures like Willie Moretti. Lansky moved in the shadows, but he wasn't alone. His network of allies made him nearly untouchable, putting Genovese in a tight predicament. He had the backing of the New Orleans families, led by Carlos Marcello, and the support of Santo Traficante and the powerful Cuban faction. The Chicago outfit, with Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca at the helm, also stood by him. Lansky still had the quiet but unwavering backing of Luciano, who was now in Sicily. Russell Bufalino from Pennsylvania, Stefano Magaddino from Buffalo, and even Sam Giancana, who was running Chicago's casino operations, were all in his corner. His links extended to New York, where he was connected to Carlo Gambino through figures like Frank Scalise and Albert Anastasia, and he maintained a close friendship with Tommy Lucchese. His business dealings with the Detroit families and operations in Las Vegas and Havana only further solidified his influence. At this point, as Luciano later observed in the late 1960s, Lansky was perhaps the most powerful man in the world of organized crime. His connections were vast, spanning multiple criminal factions and entities, making him a master of manipulation. With a mere whisper, he could orchestrate a man's downfall, or with a snap of his fingers, eliminate any opposition. He could break you or make you, and only those with immense power dared to challenge him. If there was something he wanted, Lansky was fully capable of taking it without hesitation. A man of both values and business acumen, Lansky's unmatched ability to maneuver kept him far ahead of his rivals. Even from Sicily, his old friend Charlie "Lucky" Luciano watched in awe as Lansky's influence continued to grow. Reading about Lansky in newspapers and watching newsreels in the cinema he helped build, Luciano could see the transformation happening in real time, recognizing that Lansky had become a force to be reckoned with on a global scale.